Hello, welcome to the Self Learning Platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 2 Approaches to the Study of India's Foreign Policy. And our topic is Non Alignment and Nehruvian Consensus. For a long time, particularly during the Nehruvian years, non-alignment had served as the most significant approach to the study of Indian foreign policy. India never had a more coherent view of the world and of its place therein than during the heydays of non-alignment during the 1950s and the 1960s. There was a coherence rather a consonance of the goals and instruments of Indian foreign policy until nearly the 1970s, when the so called Nehruvian consensus broke down. Ironically, for the high moral ground that Indian foreign policy had occupied on international issues, and precisely for the failure of non-aligned stance to ensure India's security in the wake of the Chinese aggression of 1962 and its great power ambition. It is, however, undeniable that a third world solidarity that had infused non-aligned policy continues to enthuse India's foreign policy in some very significant manner even today. Nehruvian consensus was built around the ideals and principles that had developed in the course of India's struggle for freedom. The influence of Mahatma Gandhi was profound on the entire course of Indian national movement. What he had struggled for was not mere political freedom, but a cultural and moral regeneration of the Indian civilization. Nehru had combined these Gandhian moral and social imperatives while analyzing the course of international relations between the two world wars. Nehru had found that the two dominant norms in international relations were the politics of power and the threat of force. It were these norms that had caused the onset of First World War, failure of League of Nations, rise of fascism, and the politics of alliance and counter-alliance leading to the outbreak of the Second World War. Nehru was very perceptive in foreseeing the working of the same norms behind the unfolding rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union. It remains a matter of debate among scholars to view Nehru as an idealist who sought to base Indian foreign policy on certain ideals, or somewhat even as a realist who accorded high importance to diplomacy in order to circumvent the power politics of international system. By placing Indian foreign policy on the precept of non-alignment, Nehru had simultaneously pushed for normative changes in the international system and thereby secure the perceived national interest of India. How did he reconcile these goals? In the first place, non alignment was based on securing the independence and freedom of action, especially of the newly independent countries of Asia and Africa. In that respect, Nehruvian foreign policy was premised on the idea of sovereign nation states as the units of the international system. Secondly, Nehru sought to upgrade the aspect of interstate cooperation in place of confrontation, which was inherent in the power politics in the international system. One such can see this pragmatic mix of idealism and hard headed national interest in at least three important concerns of Indian foreign policy under him. Non alignment was a response to the threats posed to the international system by the two superpowers armed with nuclear weapons who were engaged in encapsulating and subordinating the weaker regions of the world. In this way, the superpower rivalry that was beginning to expand beyond the Western world so as to include in its fold the countries of the developing world constituted a direct threat to the international system. In other words, Cold War marked a regression to the evolution of a universal democratic international society. Non alignment was a principled and pragmatic step to retain and widen the space for autonomy in the rapidly shrinking international public space caused by the bloc politics. Nehru was very perceptive, a realist to have foreseen the course of international relations and exhort India and the other struggling colonies against the dangers of bipolarity as early as 1946. Lack of concern for or importance attached to the national security is often the criticism leveled against the Nehruvian framework of Indian foreign policy. However, enthusiasts of the non-aligned framework argue cogently that by insisting upon the autonomy of foreign policy decision making and by containing the expansionism of Cold War, Nehru was as well addressing the core issues of national security. That non alignment was more than idealism was apparent in the context of India's relations with Pakistan. Our non aligned stance did not close the windows of opportunity towards the West, including importantly US, discouraged the formation of Soviet China axis, who were until at least 1947 close friends against India and kept relations with Pakistan and Indian position on Kashmir intact in the face of the fact of Pakistan's membership in the Western alliance system. The same primacy of diplomacy was evident in the way Nehru sought to tackle Chinese challenge to Indian security, first through Panchsheel and Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, and later building closer relations with Khrushchev Soviet Union, which was beginning to acknowledge Nam as its naturally ally. The military debacles against China notwithstanding the reliance on skillful diplomacy to keep India as a prominent power, while at the same time resetting the norms of international system away from the power politics were the hallmark of Indian foreign policy under Nehru. The relevance of Nehruvian consensus remains under debate in the changed circumstances of today. However, one may still argue that reliance on skillful diplomacy rather than military force was never more relevant than today, as India seeks to engage a whole range of powers to work out strategic understanding and economic cooperation. To the contrary is the view that considers Nehruvian consensus as outmoded and largely abandoned. For one, the international public space which had allowed Nehru and the non aligned movement in general autonomy of action has shrunk. Besides, non aligned movements itself has lost its internal coherence and unity of purpose so as to be of any relevance. Apart from putting the non aligned foreign policy of India in the larger cultural and historical context of Indian freedom movement, analysts invariably pay glowing tributes to the personal influence of Nehru on the thinking and conduct of India's foreign policy. Nehru was a keen observer of international affairs and had devoted considerable time to formulating thinking and position of the international movement on issues of international importance. He was his foreign minister. He continued to formulate the Indian foreign policy practically himself throughout his term as prime minister and would consult only a very close group of ministers including Sardar Patel, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, Dr. Radha Krishnan and V.K. Krishna Menon and officials such as Gopalaswamy Iyer, Sir B. N. Rao, Sir Girija Shankar Bajpayee, and India's first Foreign Secretary KPS Menon Sr. During the early period of the Nehru's prime ministership, the institutional and structural policy planning mechanisms were either lacking or were weak. J.N. Dixit, India's former foreign secretary, has opined Jawaharlal Nehru was the perceiver of national concerns and interests, conceptualizers of policies and options to meet them, and the initiator of policies and actions on all aspects of external affairs. He had the unique advantage of backup by unqualified national consensus on priorities as well as policies in external affairs. He was able to carry the cabinet, the parliament, the political parties, and the public opinion along with him on all important aspects of Indian foreign policy. Now let us sum up the unit. India's foreign policy combines various influences, factors, goals, and mechanisms. It is for these reasons that no single theoretical approach is appropriate for the study of India's foreign policy. The eclectic approach is perhaps the best to study of India's foreign policy. There is an indigenous quality to the writings of Indian foreign policy, and these writings are also responding to diverse forces and factors, both domestic and international. Statesmen and policy planners and practitioners also do not fit their ideas and practices into theoretical frameworks. A pursuit of these varieties of approaches nevertheless reveals the principles and ideas, mechanisms and instruments, and the actors and forces that have come to frame the objectives and devise appropriate instruments of foreign policy. And this precisely is the purpose of studying the theme of approaches to the Indian national policy. Now we want to wind up this lecture. Thank you so much for your attention, and we have come to the end of the unit.